Chapter 52 Walls of Jericho come crashing down. It was on the 10th day of the first month, Nisan, in the spring, not January, in the winter, that Israel crossed the Jordan River and made camp in Canaan at a spot called Gilgal. The west border of the camp wasn't much more than a mile away from Jericho, a thick, walled city swarming with heathen Canaanites. Joshua chapter 4, verses 19 through 24. Israel's first Passover in Canaan. It had been just 40 years before, minus 5 days, that Israel had fled from Egypt. Exodus chapter 12, verse 18, verses 29 through 34, verse 51, Numbers chapter 14 verses 26 through 35, Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 3, and Joshua chapter 5 verse 6. The Exodus had started after the first observance of Passover, and now again it was almost time to prepare for another Passover. But before it should be observed, God told Joshua that most of the males of Israel should undergo a physical rite that had been required as a sign and seal of the covenant between the Creator and Israel. After the Passover, which fell on the 7th day of the week that year, the people observed the days of unleavened bread by eating no bread with leavening inside it. One of their main dishes was roasted grain that had been taken from the fields of their enemies. This was only one item of food that had been acquired since entering the region of the Jordan. In fact, so many delicious edible things had been taken in recent days that Israel's food supply was sufficient enough to keep them from needing to gather manna. As a result, manna, which had been the main food for 40 years, ceased to appear on the day after the Passover. Joshua chapter 5 verses 2 through 12. Meanwhile, there was no sign of Canaanite soldiers except those who could be seen in the distance on the high walls of Jericho. Nevertheless, enemy spies kept a close watch on Israel. Their reports on the parting of the river spread quickly to every ruler in this section of the world. These leaders were greatly concerned by this miraculous event. They had felt temporarily secure from Israel because they considered the Jordan practically impossible to cross at this time of year. The king of Jericho was especially worried. Even though his fighting force was composed of many fierce men skilled in battle, the very large number of Israelites camped so close to his city was enough to make his nights mostly sleepless. Joshua chapter 5 verse 1. To make certain that no more Israelite spies could get into Jericho, he gave orders that the gates of the city should close and remain closed all day. No one was allowed in or out, except if necessary a few spies of his, and they were let down the walls on rope ladders and brought up the same way. This was a costly precaution, because it meant turning away caravans arriving from other lands with valuables and food. The king reasoned that it was wiser to remain bottled up with what food was on hand rather than take the slightest risk of allowing any Israelites to enter Jericho in disguise. Joshua chapter 6 verse 1. Joshua meets the Lord. A few days after Israel had arrived in Gilgal, Joshua went alone, despite the protests of his bodyguards and some of his officers, toward Jericho. He wished to see for himself what the place was like at a closer range. He suddenly found himself face to face with a sturdy man holding a gleaming sword and gazing intently at him. Joshua strode boldly up to this man. "Are you a friend of Israel or an enemy?" Joshua bluntly inquired of the stranger. Joshua chapter 5 verse 13. "I am not an enemy," the man replied in a firm voice. "I am here as the commander of the army of God." It required several seconds for Joshua to realize that he was actually gazing at the Lord, the very one who later came to this world in human form to be known as Jesus Christ, and who also appeared to Abraham as Melchizedek, the king of Salem. This was Joshua's closest contact with God. He fearfully fell forward and placed his forehead on the ground. "What is it you ask of me, my lord?" Joshua humbly inquired. We know this man was the Lord, a member of the Godhead, because he allowed Joshua to worship him. Angels never allow God's servants to worship them. Revelation chapter 22 verses 8 and 9. "Your feet are on holy ground," was the answer. "Remove your shoes at once, and I shall tell you how you can take Jericho." Joshua lost no time in obeying. Then he carefully listened to the instructions from God. Joshua chapter 5 verses 14 and 15. "Return to your camp and carry out the orders I have given to you," he was told. "If you do just as I have told you to do, it won't be necessary for you to swarm the walls or knock down the gates of Jericho in order to conquer it, even though many fierce fighting men are inside the walls of that fortress." Inspired and encouraged in what he should do, Joshua returned to camp. Once he turned to gaze back at where he had encountered the Lord, but there was no one there. As soon as Joshua arrived back in camp, to the relief of his officers and men, he told them and the priests of his unusual experience and of God's plan to take over Jericho. Joshua chapter 6 verses 2 through 7. The siege of Jericho begins. Next day, the king of Jericho was startled by the dreadful news he had been expecting. "Sentries have just reported seeing many persons on foot approaching from the Israelite camp," an officer announced. Surrounded by anxious aides and officers, the king hurried to the walls. When he saw the growing column of people marching toward his city, he nervously barked out orders for all the soldiers to take their battle stations, and for all civilians to get off of the walls and streets and out of the shops and into their homes or shelters. As the Canaanites continued watching, they became discouraged, confused, and then relieved in those turns. The foremost of their approaching enemies marched just close enough for discerning that they were soldiers. Then they veered to the left and moved along to the south of the city. "Why should they give us such a wide berth if they intend to attack?" one officer asked. "Perhaps they don't intend to attack," another observed. "Possibly they're just moving to the west." "That hardly seems possible," the king muttered. "They've taken every city from the Arnon River to Mount Hermon." Rising hope that Israel was only moving out and passing by Jericho was abruptly dashed when the foremost Israelite soldiers turned north to parallel the west wall of the city. A short time later, they turned back eastward to distantly flank Jericho's north wall. The city was being surrounded by thousands upon thousands of Israelites. Why they remained at such a distance baffled the Canaanite defenders. Another mystery to those on the walls of Jericho was the presence of 7 long-robed horn blowers, marching behind the first large segment of soldiers of the moving column. As they marched, they held up carved trumpets called shofarim, which were made of the horns of rams, and emitted shrill blasts that echoed from the hills to the west. Behind these horn blowers marched 4 more robed men carrying what appeared to be a large, ornate box. The Canaanites had no way of knowing that this object was the Ark of the Covenant, and that the other 7 robed men were priests who had been instructed to blow special horns. This was the only sound that came from the Israelites. It was frightfully puzzling to their watchers, because it was the usual habits of soldiers on the march to shout or sing. In this case, the Israelite soldiers had been told not to utter a word during the marching around Jericho. For well over an hour, the Canaanites uneasily watched the enemy parade. It required somewhat more than that for any part of the marchers to pass around Jericho and return to the Israelites' camp. Jericho's ruler remained on the wall, gravely puzzled as to the meaning of such a weird demonstration. Joshua chapter 6 verses 8 through 11. "Didn't anyone here think to try counting them?" he impatiently asked his officers. "The Canaanites' fear mounts." "We have estimated that about 100,000 passed around the city, sir," an officer spoke out. "As you know, sir, our spies have reported that Israel has at least 5 or 6 times that many soldiers." "Spies are not always right," the king murmured. "This performance today seems to me to be only a display of manpower that isn't necessarily there. How do we know that all of them were men? Most of them could have been women and children dressed as soldiers. Why did they parade at such a distance unless they fear our spears, arrows, and catapults? If they don't come closer, they cannot harm us. Even as besiegers, they would have to hold out many days before our supplies are exhausted. and that isn't the pattern of their operation. These weakly optimistic remarks from the king did little to generate hope or enthusiasm in those about him. The next day, however, brought a little relief to the Canaanites from their fears when dawn showed no evidence of further siege preparations. Before long, however, it was observed that the Israelites were again approaching Jericho. Renewed excitement and fear reigned in the city for a while. Then, as they had done the day before, the Israelites swerved southward, later continuing westward to march at a distance from the south wall, swinging north around the west wall, and going eastward past the north wall and then back to their camp. Again, there was no chanting, shouting, or even song from the Israelite soldiers. The only sound was that of the 7 horns, whose continuous piercing tones carried loudly to the Canaanites in an irritating, suspenseful, and nerve-wracking manner. This is obviously some kind of enchantment by which Israel is trying to overcome us without attacking us. The king of Jericho proclaimed to his people after the Israelites had finished their second day of marching around his city, "Why should we allow enchantments from these foreigners to bother us? I have heard that they only have one God. We have many more gods that will protect us." Next day, the Israelites appeared for the 3rd time to march around Jericho in the same manner and at the same distance. As usual, there was the strange box-like object, and the 7 men going before it while blowing on their shofarim. On the 4th day, the same thing happened. By now, many of the Canaanites were becoming increasingly fearful because they didn't know just what to expect. Some believed that a great consuming fire might fall down upon them from the sky. Others were afraid of all kinds of calamities. Some, in an effort to hide their growing fears, began to make jokes about the Israelites. Next day, the Israelites came around again, and this time, although the ruler of Jericho wasn't completely in favor of it, the soldiers lining the tops of the walls lifted their voices in loud taunts and teases to the Israelites to come closer. The ruler didn't wish to do anything to rouse the ire of his enemy, but at the same time he felt that his soldiers' morale could be sparked up if they were allowed to make fun of Israel. The marchers could plainly hear the challenges, but they remained silent except for the blaring of their 7 horns. For 6 days, the Israelites marched once around the city in the early morning of each day. Joshua chapter 6, verses 12 through 14. On the 6th day, the Canaanites shouted even louder at the Israelites as they passed around the city, though they actually believed that if the whole Israelite fighting force should accept their dares and attack them, losses by the Canaanites would be much greater than any harm they could inflict upon the people of Israel. "This is a silly, time-consuming, childish game these nomadic people are playing," Jericho's ruler announced to the people and soldiers in an effort to boost his people's morale. "Their intended enchantment failed to work the first time, and now they're merely repeating it again and again in the hope that it will finally take effect. It should be plain by now that these people cannot harm us by any means. The city's king just could not understand God's plan of attack." Israelite tactics change. Inasmuch as the Israelites had been encircling Jericho a little after sunrise each day, Canaanite sentries were surprised again when they saw the marching column approaching at early dawn on the 7th day. High officers feared that this might indicate some drastic change in Israel's plans, and the king was immediately notified of what was happening outside his walls. The Israelites went around the city in the same manner as usual, but the more interesting fact was, instead of returning to camp, they began to walk around the city again. In fact, they spent almost the whole day marching around Jericho. By mid-afternoon, they had made 6 rounds and were starting upon the 7th. Joshua chapter 6, verse 15. At this point, another unusual thing happened. Hundreds of thousands more soldiers had strode out from Israel's camp and now joined the marchers. The bright, palm-studded plains around Jericho gradually grew dark with the growing immensity of armed men. The challenging hoots and shouts that had been coming from the Canaanites on the wall died away quickly when Israel's military strength was displayed. Many people within the city fell into a state of panic when they realized how many fighting men were actually confronting them. This fear and panic spread like a contagious disease, only much more rapidly. Even the ruler and his officers were grim-faced and nervously silent. No jeering taunts nor attempts to belittle Israel's might could boost the Canaanites' morale now that they were faced by the stark cold fact of Israel's true strength. The people inside the walls of Jericho felt doomed. It was late afternoon when the Israelites finally finished marching around the city for the 7th time. At this stage, the ark and the horn blowers were just east of Jericho. There they stopped, and all the other marchers came to a halt. Greater tension gripped the Canaanites. Jericho's king, who had been squirming in anxiety in his chair inside one of the towers on the wall, came slowly to his feet. He stared wide-eyed out at Israel's silently threatening throng. At that moment, the 7 horn blowers who had not sounded for several minutes blew an unusually long, high blast. This was followed by a chilling surge of shouts from the people surrounding Jericho, those in Israel's camp and many who were spread out between, as Joshua had commanded them to do. The noise that resulted from the millions of throats was that of like a giant tidal wave crashing against a rocky cliff. Divine Overthrow. Within seconds, however, the vast din of voices was drowned in another noise, an ominous deep rumble approaching like the growing reverberation of the hooves of millions of swiftly running horses. Those on the walls felt a sickening sway. Those inside the city were aghast to see widening cracks appear in the cobbled and bricked streets. Screaming people began to pour out of their buildings, and those on the walls began to race down the steps and ladders to a firmer footing. But it was too late to find safety. The walls as well as the streets were cleaving in two. In the midst of the ear-splitting crash, the king and his officers were among the first to realize in these final moments of their life that the mighty God of Israel didn't even recognize their puny, powerless idols and their gods of this world. Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 39, Isaiah chapter 45 verse 5, 1 Corinthians chapter 8 verses 5 and 6, and Isaiah chapter 2 verses 20 and 21. Then the walls of Jericho buckled violently outward and crashed down with a deafening roar. Joshua chapter 6 verse 20. Skeptics used to ridicule this miracle from God, but the skeptics were wrong. Jericho's walls did fall down flat. Archaeologists have found the ruins of Jericho just where God said the city was. And after carefully excavating the site for several years, world-famous archaeologists found that the earth had preserved an amazing record of God's miraculous destruction of Jericho. The walls of the city that fell in Joshua's day could clearly be seen to have fallen outward and flat, as the Bible stated in Joshua chapter 6 verse 20. This record has been described in many books dealing with Jericho, though the date assigned for the collapse of the wall is usually not correct. In only one place was the wall left partially standing. That must have been where Rahab's house was built, because God had promised to protect her and her family because of her incredible faith. Hebrews chapter 11 verses 30 and 31.